Hello, fellow Rustacean. Ben and I always harp on how Rustacean Station is a community podcast, that even though we are the ones who host episodes most frequently, we are always looking for other people with something to say in the Rust world. And to our delight, Nell Shamrell-Harrington, the lead editor of This Week in Rust, got in touch with us the other day, asking if Rustacean Station would be a good place to host a weekly podcast for This Week in Rust. We jumped at the chance, and so without further ado, here is the very first episode.
Hello everyone, this is the first episode of the This Week in Rust podcast. I'm Nell Shamrell-Harrington, I'm the lead editor of This Week in Rust, and an engineer on the Rust team at Mozilla. Every week, this podcast will highlight a few items from the This Week in Rust newsletter. Eventually, I hope to have guests each week to discuss some key stories and announcements, as well as the occasional deep dive episodes into some aspect of Rust and the Rust community. This Week in Rust, the newsletter, is usually published on Tuesdays and sent out on Wednesdays. I will most likely be recording this podcast on Monday night, so a link to it can be included in the newsletter. So if you want a chance for your story to be highlighted in the podcast, make sure to get your pull requests in early each week. I am linking to the This Week in Rust GitHub repo in the show notes. And let's go ahead and dive into this week's highlights. Rust turned 5 years old this week. It's been 5 wonderful years of pursuing faster, more reliable, and safer software. Check out the core team's blog post looking back on how the language has changed and grown in the open and thorough work of our diverse community of individuals. The title of the article is 5 Years of Rust, and it's the very first item on the news and blog post list. The next highlighted article was actually posted last year, but brought to our attention this week. It's called The Case for Using Rust for Automotive Software by Sojan James. It is a fascinating article that uses the 2019 fire in Notre Dame Cathedral to illustrate some of the differences between creating automotive software with C++ and creating it with Rust. Definitely check it out. One of the Rust teams I am personally a member of is the infrastructure team. We have been working on migrating our projects to use GitHub Actions for our continuous delivery and integration system. Matthias Costa published an article highlighting how he creates Rust releases for both single and multiple targets with GitHub Actions. It's a great reference both for getting started with building Rust software through GitHub Actions, as well as a great introduction to GitHub Actions itself. Something that has encouraged me as much of our world remains on lockdown is seeing how many Rust meetups are still being held online. It is awesome that we can still connect with each other virtually. Many of these meetups are also posting their recordings on YouTube, and it's a great way to see content from around the world. This week's newsletter features a video of the Rust and C++ Cardiff virtual meetup from the UK. It features 4 talks on Rust and C++, as well as a lightning talk. If you've been missing your local Rust meetup, check out what's available online. There is a lot out there. Finally, I've also personally really been enjoying how Rust developers have started streaming their development through YouTube, Twitch, and other streaming services. If you are a newer Rust developer or even an advanced developer who just wants to brush up on the fundamentals, you'll like the one called Jonathan Teaches Jason Rust. You can follow right along as Jonathan Turner, a prominent Rust community member, takes Jason Turner, a C++ expert, through the basics of Rust development. If you have always wanted to contribute to open source projects but don't know where to start, look in the call for participation section for tasks that you can pick up and get started with. This week, we feature an issue from the CLAP project, the command line argument parser for Rust, which has a mentor available to help. We also have a couple of issues from the Kaken project, an elegant rendering engine written in Rust. Both of these projects are great opportunities to get involved with open source software and the Rust language. The RFC, or request for comment process, is at the core of how the Rust project operates. This week, the RFC, which proposes transitioning to using Rust Analyzer as our official language server protocol, or LSP implementation, is now in final comment period, which means that it is reaching a decision soon. If you have an opinion on this, now is the time to express it in that RFC. The link to it is also in the show notes. There is also a new RFC about reading into uninitialized buffers. This RFC focuses on the read trait, specifically how when you use it, it requires that the buffer passed to its various methods be pre-initialized, even though the contents will be immediately overwritten. This RFC proposes an interface to allow implementers and consumers of read types to robustly and soundly work with uninitialized buffers. If you are curious about this, if you have opinions, thoughts, or questions, definitely head over to that RFC and comment. Finally, there are several upcoming events in the Rust community. This week and next, there are a lot of meetups happening online from across the world. This includes meetups in Vancouver, BC, Turin, Italy, Dallas, Texas, Berlin, and Montreal. There is also a meetup in Durham, North Carolina called the Triangle Rustaceans. Meetups are a great way to not only learn Rust, but also to connect with the fantastic community that has made Rust so successful. And because many of these meetups are now online, you can connect with Rust communities from around the world. And that's all for this week's podcast. There are many more items in this week's newsletter. Be sure to read it to keep up with all the awesome things going on in the Rust world. This Week in Rust is edited by myself, Andre Bogus, and Colton Donnelly. This week's newsletter's contributors include, using their GitHub usernames, Mr. Costa, Nick Wilcox, P. Sunkar, and Zoni. Thank you so much to everyone who contributes to This Week in Rust. And thank you also to the Rustacean Station for hosting this podcast. I will be back next week bringing you more of the wonderful news from the wonderful world of Rust. Take care, everyone.